at. So at this point in time, I am going to call the meeting to order for the Senate Education Committee. And committee, I did tell you that we were going to start with budget recommendations, and then we would move on to our hearings. But I am actually wanting us to do budget recommendations. I want us to work on a couple of our bills so that our three committee members can get back to their other committee. So at this point in time, we are waiting for the printout. We made a few minor modifications to what I shared with you yesterday with regard to dyslexia. We will have that copy as soon as that gets down here. So I'm going to start off with the School for the Deaf. And I'm going to ask if there are any recommendations for changes with regard to the Kansas School for the Deaf. Senator Straw.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, this is not for the School for the Deaf, but where can we find those budgets? What days were they on? Are they all listed in testimony for today?
I believe you have your hard copies.
Yes, but I didn't bring my papers. I try to do most of it online here. Is it easy to tell me which day of that? Okay, that's what I needed. Thank you.
So for anyone following, we said it was on February 8th, is that correct? Okay. Okay. So we'll give folks a moment to pull that up. And I do want to apprise the committee that I received an email I'm sorry, here we go. I'm sorry. Yesterday, an email was sent to me, trying to open it up. And it was to let me know, as well as Senator Billinger, who is overseeing Ways and Means, that right now, conversation is in the process with Melissa Rooker of the Children's Candidate and Trust Fund, and they are working to address the issue of making sure that we continue on a plan for implementing phase 3 for the LAP in collaboration with the Part C program from KDHE. So I know that was an ask, and there was a concern about the funding because the Kansas School for the Deaf has been paying for those phase 1 and phase 2 out of budget, and that additional budget wasn't approved for fiscal year 2022. And so that is the latest update that we do have. And part of that component means actually training people to go out and to do the evaluations. So at this point in time, and we certainly do appreciate that we are having two different groups that are willing to work together to make sure this happens for our kids, particularly our kids that are deaf and hard of hearing. So we unfortunately will not, for today's work, have the final plan, but they have already begun the meetings, and they do feel within the next 4 weeks or so that the working group will have the details. Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And, as part of that, from birth to 3, it's the reimbursement is through Part C for the tiny K reimbursement. And then after that, they would have IEPs. And so then that funding would be coming through that stream. And as we make our recommendation, this would be the recommendation would be, my suggestion would be, the recommendation would be to look at this issue in the omnibus budget. That's what will go to the Ways and Means Committee, and that's where we look at any issues that aren't resolved or any issues that, as you have the letter that's come from the Children's Cabinet, that would be that would be a reasonable way to deal with this.
Okay, so I think if we could please have a motion, and I think, Norma, you might be able to help us with this language, but I think what we need is a motion that when Ways and Means is working on the omnibus budget, that it does circle back to see where we are with regard to the plan as far as funding for the Phase 3 for the language assessment program. Is that correct, Norma?
Madam Chair, I'll be willing to make a motion and include that.
Okay. I just want to make sure that, can we get feedback from Norma, please?
Certainly, Madam Chair, can everyone hear me okay?
We can.
So yeah, the motion could simply read that Senate Ways and Means review at omnibus the implementation of Phase 3 of the language assessment program. And if there are particular agencies you'd like to recommend that they see if they can request their appearance, whether it be the School for the Deaf or KDHE or the Department of Education. You could certainly include those as well. So review at omnibus, the implementation, and request reports from whichever agencies, if there are particular agencies you'd like to hear from as well.
I think that we need to include the Children's Cabinet on that list. So Senator Petty, if you want to go ahead and make your motion.
Certainly. I'll make a motion that we approve the budget recommendations for the governor's budget recommendations for 2021 and 22, and include a request to look at the funding for implementation of Phase 3 of the deaf and hard of hearing assessments.
And they refer to that as the Language Assessment Program, LAP.
Sorry, the Language Assessment Program.
That's fine. Okay, so we have a motion from Senator Petty.
Madam Chair, this is Norma.
Yes.
Could the maker of the motion just clarify that the request is that Senate Ways and Means review at omnibus the funding of the implementation of Phase 3 of the Language Assessment Program?
Thank you. I would amend my motion that Senate Ways and Means review, which I cannot say, at omnibus, the assessment funding.
Additionally, Madam Chair, I apologize. If there are specific agencies, so the Children's Cabinet, that this committee would like Senate Ways and Means to seek information from, that can either be included in the motion, or of course, Senate Ways and Means can simply choose to ask the agencies to come in and report on it.
I think it would be appropriate that we add the Children's Cabinet as well as the Kansas School for the Deaf.
Well, I think the Department of Education, because IEPs are through the Department of Education.
That's fine. Add the Department of Education as well.
Certainly, Madam Chair. So if I might just clarify the motion real quick. The motion is for the governor's recommendation with the request that Senate Ways and Means review the implementation of Phase 3 of the Language Assessment Program at omnibus with information from the Department of Education, Children's Cabinet, and School for the Deaf.
I think it would have to be funding for the implementation of Phase 3. Thank you.
Funding for implementation. Sorry.
Thank you. And we have a second from Senator Dietrich. Is there any discussion at this point in time? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Now I'd like us to transition to the school, Kansas School for the Blind.
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion to pass out the governor's budget recommendations for 21 and 22 for the School for the Blind.
Is there a second? Okay, I'm sorry, I have a second. So I have a motion from Senator Petty and a second from Senator Sykes. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Now, committee, we will move to something that might take a little bit more time, but we are going to move forward. And we do have some extras from the audience, and our assistant will upload that when she is able to, so that the committee knows. Let's see if we can get this organized. So we have had discussion with regard to the issue of the lack of recommendation for the Dyslexia Coordinator position. And so this is what the recommendation entails. So we have a statement. It also, in boldface, the Senate Education Committee agrees with the Legislative Task Force on Dyslexia that all Kansas teachers must be trained in the science of reading. We strongly recommend the Kansas Department of Education and Ways and Means Committee work to leverage state and federal relief funds to conduct this training for Kansas teachers without delay. We do know that there has been discussion from House and Senate leadership with the Department of Education with regard to availability of funds. But to make this happen, we have these other recommendations which are above and beyond where we are for fiscal year 21 and the governor's recommendation for fiscal year 22. So what I have done is I've included the components, and right behind the components, I've put the fiscal year that they would actually go into place. So the first one is the Dyslexia Coordinator position. I have down for fiscal year 2022 because we know that whole budget process will take a period of time. Even with the department posting the position, when we have a national search, it will take time to determine who to bring in to be interviewed and for that actual placement. So this position would start as early as July 1, 2021, which is the start of fiscal year 22. It may be later. The next component we have is the Center for Reading Project Manager or Manager's Grant. So it could be a full-time or several part-time positions. And this is to continue that process so that even while we're waiting for the coordinator position to be filled, that they would start working on that accumulation and recommendations for lists that could be accessed by school districts, by our universities and colleges. They can start also coming up with that train the trainer so that school district administration can begin making plans for in-service and professional development curriculum opportunities. The next one is a stipend for an interim dyslexia coordinator. And that is in the case that perhaps that coordinator couldn't start July 1, or they might just be a consultant depending on when the start date is on the coordinator. And so that would include some funds from fiscal year 2021, as well as funds from fiscal year 2022. And the reason we're putting the fiscal year there is because, just as a reminder, these items are not in the recommended budget for fiscal year 2021, of which honestly we're 3/4 of the way through. And then the last one is that implementation grant. So that the committee knows, I have been in communication. In fact, we've gone back and forth and have talked at length with Dr. Craig Dunswander. And we know that currently in the Department of Education, there are 28.2 vacant full FTE, full-time equivalent positions. So those are positions that perhaps haven't been filled this fiscal year, or someone retired or left the Department of Education, and they haven't been filled yet. That simply means that what was budgeted for those salaries, as well as wages and benefits, have not been expended. With regard to these, my ask of the Department of Education is those funds that they haven't expended, rather than doing end of fiscal year spending, waiting to do hiring until we start fiscal year 2022, or posting the position, hiring the individual, but them not starting until July 1, 2022. Would they be able to find a reduction within their current fiscal year 2021 budget that has been approved, but is in our column? Could they find within that budget to fund the two positions, so the project manager's grant as well as the stipend for these remaining 4 months of fiscal year 2021? And I'm not sure if Craig is online, but he did say that for the purposes of our meeting today, that yes, they will be able to fund that for fiscal year 2021. That those positions that haven't been filled, that they haven't posted and hired yet, they have the funds to cover for 2021. He cannot project out what portions that they might be able to cover for 2022, but that's entirely a possibility. So as an example, the Dyslexia Coordinator position we have at $100,000 for fiscal year 2022. If they do not hire that individual, if that contract does not start until perhaps September, we have 2 months of that $100,000 salary that was not paid out. So they have some flexibility there. And he knows that he can offset that for other items that are within this proposal. So I wanted to give, first of all, the committee the assurance on that we have done that due diligence, and that they absolutely intend to cover any of the 2021 expenses that are in this proposal. So we do have support with regard to the Department of Education with this. The chairman of the State Board of Education has seen this and is supportive. We have talked to multiple folks. There has been all kinds of phone calls and interest with regard to the grant for the colleges and universities. Now, there has been some concern about it is prescriptive. And if you look at the first bullet of the implementation grant, which is on the back page, the award goes to those schools of education that have made that transition to only the science of reading, instruction, and training in the elementary education curricula. And that would be that they are ready to start that instruction with that change in curricula for August 2021, which is the first semester of the fiscal year 2022. There is concern that that is prescriptive. I have assured them that that is in line, in keeping with what the State Board of Education had voted on. The only thing that is different is this is an earlier start date. The colleges and universities have another year and a half to get this implemented. So again, this is urging them not to wait. And the reward for not waiting and implementing ahead of schedule is they would have some funds. And it would be up to the schools of education. They might decide to give a stipend to the teachers that perhaps worked over the summer to get that curriculum change. It is not a mandate. So colleges and universities that want to wait for the later deadline are able to. This is the reward for not waiting. And so when I have talked, I've had a conversation with 3 different universities and have told them, you make your determination at your university at the pace. But if you do not comply with what the Department of Education has already approved, then we will be talking about different issues, and it won't be grants or rewards. So everyone understands it, and they also understand that it's not this committee that's talking about that change. That has come from the State Board of Education based on the recommendations from the Dyslexia Task Force. So the language has come from those two groups, the task force as well as State Board of Education in their approval of the timeline. I'm going to pause right there, and are there questions about this? Yes.
Thank you,
Senator
Madam
Dietrich.
Chair. Thank you. I've had a few of those phone calls as well.
Right.
So,
All of a sudden, they're very interested in what's happening in this committee.
but you know what? That's a good thing.
It is.
They're paying attention.
Yep.
And I do appreciate some of the things that the colleges and universities are doing. They sent me a list of some of the trainings and how they've reviewed their curriculum. So I've got just a quick question on that wording. Could a university that's using evidence-based instruction based on the science of reading, like that letters instruction, and they're training their teachers and using that as a pre-service piece of their curriculum, would that qualify them for that? Or when you say only the science of reading, I'm just wondering what you have in mind.
Well, and this is what I have told the different universities, one university president and two other representatives. The ward's going to be divided and determined by the Dyslexia Coordinator or the interim coordinator. What we are looking for, and here's what we know to be true, not all of the reading courses are taught in one semester. But what we do know with regard to the science of reading is that there are multiple components to it. So for it, in my mind, for it to be eligible, they need to have determined that they will be providing all of those elements or components to it. Now, does that mean all of those are taught in one semester and it happens to be the fall semester? No. But I think for those of us that have been in education, we know that you could come up with a syllabus for a course in an hour and a half. But we're talking about the rubber hitting the road. It's not a syllabus, it's what's been put in practice. So what support materials do they already have? What textbooks or course materials are they requiring for the courses, and how have they mapped that out in their curriculum for those elementary education majors? So they would have to demonstrate more than just, yep, we're doing it. So, and that's why we're not awarding it. The Department of Education, the funding is coming through them, but it is going to be that working relationship that we are working to start and establish with that coordinator. So they will have that oversight in awarding that. Senator, I'm sorry, did you have another follow-up?
I just want to say thank you. I just really appreciate the focus on this dyslexia coordinator and the grants and the training. And I mean, we've been talking about this for years. So thank you. That's really all. Thank you very much.
Senator Gossage, I know you had a question.
So I'm sorry that I had to come in late. I was across the hall at the other meeting. But thank you for this. My question is, we have funding for now, but what about going forward?
Here's what we do know. So we have funding for now. So that implementation of those two components for fiscal year 2021, we have a commitment from the Department of Education. We are putting in this recommendation, and this is going up to Ways and Means, so our job doesn't stop here. We're going to need to talk to those committee members to make sure they understand and have that buy-in, as well as other legislators. And then we're going to have to make sure that when we are conference committee with the House, that this is there. So this is just the first big step. Now, then what has to happen is we are going to need to make sure, and the Department of Education is going to have to, next year, when they come with the budget ask for fiscal year 2023, this position of coordinator will be in there. The coordinator will determine if there are other things, whether the 2 grants and the stipend need to stay in there, or if they're removed. And the Department of Education is going to have to figure out what are their priorities. I did challenge, I had a tussle, a little bit of conversation with Dr. Nunswander with the fact that they had filled a new coordinator position for STEM coordinator. And I said, I'm a little surprised because if I was to pick something first, it would have been this, not the STEM coordinator, because we already have those core courses. But that was the choice that was made by the Department of Ed and was approved by the State Board of Education. So again, it's going to be the different groups that are going to have to work together, and the Department of Education is going to have to, 1, make this work, and 2, sell it. But one thing that I know to be true, the heavy lift is to get something into the budget, and oftentimes once it's there, then it's other things that get cut, or they just remain in there. But I do feel, and just so that we understand where we are as a state, if we get this truly working and really get this dyslexia education jump-started, we will be only the 3rd state in the nation that has decided to wrestle with this from pre-K to university level. We will only be the 3rd state. So I feel that as it ripples out, as parents see the change, as teachers see the change, as universities see the change, they will be on board with this.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as those of us who've been in education, we know this is just one more important tool in the toolbox. I am concerned, there are a few concerns I have, and I know that they probably have kind of others from universities. And one of them is when you refer to the State Board of Education, that, and we really haven't talked about this in relation to the whole thing with dyslexia, but that the State Board of Education didn't approve those revised standards until the fall of 2020. So they haven't been in place. So I think it's important for the committee to think about in relation to universities getting programming up and running and staff trained. And I received emails from Emporia. I'm not a graduate of Emporia, graduate of KU, but I received from Emporia about their science of reading. They are in the process of their graduate and undergraduate program. They do have, and I haven't had time to check with other of our other regions institutions, but knowing that, you know, Emporia is often considered our lead education institution, they do have staff that are getting training, that are getting a certification. And as you know, and I'm sure others on this committee know, it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't just happen because somebody says they want to take a summer's course. It's more long-term. So that's what I am somewhat concerned with on the implementation grants of the fall 22, August 21 semester, that's overly aggressive when we have those that are actually in the implementation phases and are developing the staff to do the reading standards instruction at the university. So when we have academia that are doing it, not just, I know sometimes we think that things move a little slower, and people often think that happens here as well. But when we have them doing it and they're sharing information about what they're doing, it does cause me concern that we want to have good programs and we want to have them implemented well, and not, as you brought up early, to feel that it's being any way punitive, that there's a punitive action that's in place because they're not moving at a certain speed.
So nothing punitive is being done, and I am going to just share with the committee, though the State Board of Education made the approval in 2020, We had a joint hearing of both education committees where this need of change in universities, that was presented in 2019. And what we heard at that time was the universities did not have any interest in making a change. They have been well aware of the recommendation from the Dyslexia Task Force since 2019. Formal recommendations came out in 2019. So here we are at the tail end. We're halfway through the second semester of a college year, and I'm going to just remind the committee that in March, when the governor shut down our schools, it wasn't just K through 12. And in every university and every community college and every technical college, they had to turn their delivery around on a dime. They had to convert from face-to-face to online only, and they did that within 2 weeks. And what did that mean? It meant folks, our professors in our state universities, colleges, community colleges, and technical colleges, they spent 40, 60, 80 hours for 2 to 3 weeks to make it deliverable virtually for our students. Funds came in to reimburse students that were unable or did not want to participate on online. It can be done. And it's not punitive. This is simply for those that are almost there. Here's a carrot, and that is an opportunity to partake in some grant money to spend the time this summer. It recognizes that the state legislature is serious about this, and we will continue to be watching. There's no penalty for any college or university that doesn't implement until the deadline that the State Board of Education has made. This is simply, if you don't want to wait until the deadline and you get it initiated, here's your just reward. And I do feel that there are those that are inspired by a carrot, and there are those that are inspired by a stick. And so until we put a carrot out there, we'll just see what happens. I think some can do it. In fact, in talking to Emporia State today, they're almost there. And I do believe when Emporia State, as an example, I also heard from Fort Hays, they think they're close. So this might be just what spurns them. And should they get that achieved, wonderful, and we will recognize them and acknowledge that work. And then they will be able to help other colleges and universities implement. And they will be able to share that knowledge. And so I don't see it as negative that some will get done sooner than others, because it is very dependent on who they have as far as professors, what they have as far as availability of time, and what leadership comes from the deans. And so I don't think we have to, there's no spank for not getting it done by next fall. We will be looking for those that don't have it implemented by the deadline the State Board of Education comes up with. Senator Straub, you had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this approximately adding all of these grants and positions together, the cost is approximately $250,000 in total for the entire program or each individual school district?
This is not a school district.
It's
Just through the Department of Education. So it will be across the street that will oversee it. So funds will potentially go out to some universities with that grant on the back. The Dyslexia Coordinator position will be housed across the street, but they will be going out and visiting and working with school districts as well as universities. So they're going to have a multi-focus in working to get this implemented. The Center for Reading will help in that process. You know, we talked about yesterday about a list. And so right now in our state, they have that expertise, and they're going to cull together that information that will be made available for school districts to use and for universities and colleges to use. So this is just what will get us through the rest of this fiscal year and next fiscal year.
Okay, wonderful. I don't have a problem with that, but I have one other question.
Uh-huh.
So I have no problem at all. I can't believe we haven't been doing this before. But in my calculations of looking at the overall Department of Education budget, that the increase from, let me look at my notes, the increase from actual expenditures in 2020 to the agency's request in 2022 is 260 million. And the difference between the governor's recommendation in 2022 to the actual in 2020 is 214 million. It's also come to my attention that we have approximate decrease in public school enrollments of over 18,000 students. 18,000 students times the approximate base aid is around $86 million, not thousands, not billions, but in that budget, there's additional funding of, let's just say 250 million, when in all actuality, just the base aid decrease in enrollments, we should be lowering this budget by over 80 million. Can somebody help me with these numbers?
I will help you in this context. So when we are looking at the budget for the Department of Education, there's the budget to operate the department that's housed here in the capital city. And then we have the funding for the school districts. So the funding for the school districts has been negotiated out, and we have locked into that formula. So the increases that you are seeing are really not so much what's happening across the street as far as increases, though there are very modest pay increases. But what you are seeing is, and we've talked about this before with regard to school funding, that what they receive, what schools receive this year for funding is based on last year's enrollment. And next year, it's pretty much baked in there, it's going to be based on whatever was the highest of the 3 prior years. So this year, you're right, it's 18,000 fewer students. We could make a change to the funding formula, but what we have heard from the Attorney General is that will take us right to another across the street, and that is going to be the state Supreme Court. Now, are there things that could be done with regard to school funding? There are. We are still working through that and determining that, but we are not ready to make a recommendation. One of the things that we did here in legislative post-audit was reserve funds, unencumbered funds, and that of every one of the schools that they audited, none of them had a policy about funds being in the reserve. So one of the things that we could look at is giving some guidelines to what those levels of reserves can't be more than this, can't be less than this, because we don't want them to be in a position where they couldn't keep their budget moving forward. We can look at transportation, and transportation that wasn't utilized because schools were closed. So those are things that we can talk about, and we will talk about, but it's not something that right now in this budget we are even close to ready to address. We haven't even figured out KEMA yet. But this is something that is going to take a lot of attention, and I'm not ready for us to end up back in the courts again, because that wastes money every which way. So that's why you're seeing that difference and that increase. And another portion of that is, and we'll get a copy if distributive, if it hasn't been uploaded, But we did receive from the Department of Education where they showed what the 20 mills, how that continued to not only grow, but in the last 2 or 3 years, it has jumped significantly. And so we will discuss if there's a way to approach that. I know in the House, they have talked about clawback, and so we may be seeing that bill coming to us. And so we will have hearings on that. And when we get done with turnaround, we will continue to have hearings with regard to what is and isn't happening in our schools. One more question, then we're going to move on to 1-2.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just for the record also, none of the COVID relief funds are included in these numbers, correct?
They are not, and I will urge the committee to go back and look at that. It was very startling to me, the amount of funds that had not been drawn down yet. And what we do know, different agencies drew those funds down so that they could shift funds from this fiscal year to next. That hasn't happened in education. So next I have Senator Gossage, and then I have Senator O'Shea. Senator Gossage.
Just back to this, if I may.
Uh-huh.
And that is, I know you put an awful lot of time in this, and so have other people. Being a logistics person, I'm trying to get it down to Adam, my son. And I'm saying, how will this dyslexia coordinator, which I'm totally for, and this curriculum, which I read about it online, by the way, it sounds great. We're getting away from the full language immersion, whole language approach, back to phonemes, which is where we should have been in the beginning. And so as we look at that approach, I would like to see us somehow, whether that's in committee or in some of the work that you're doing, how does that affect the Adams of the world? How does that affect the dyslexic child in the classroom? Does that do anything about reducing the class size of kindergarten, first and second? And how might we actually see a difference? Because you can take a teacher and you can train her and have her go take a couple of classes. She feels, oh, wow, this is a great approach to reading. But, you know, if she's got 25 first graders, that's really not going to do what we want it to do. That was my point. Thought I would bring that up.
So I will simply share with you, thank you for the question. I think that yesterday's hearing on at-risk funding is very important, because if you go back and read through that again, one of the key changes is that it allows at-risk funding to be used for training and professional development. So it can pay that teacher to get training in the summer. It can pay for that professional development during the school year. It can pay for all of those materials that they haven't implemented. Also, it will allow them, for those reading specialists that already have this training, to hire those individuals. Right. But again, so that they're getting those specific services. So, Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to encourage everyone to ask their counties. I asked one of my counties about the COVID-specific funds and what were their plans to draw down everything, and some of them have more flexibility where they can take them they have more time to take them, but also part of it was when the reporting occurred. But I just thought that was good. That's a good thing to ask our counties, and something feasible we can do to help hold them accountable as well. Thank you.
And we do know that there's a significant amount of additional money that's going to be coming this way from the new legislature. And I will tell you that I have received many phone calls saying, so what's the legislature doing on oversight for that for schools? And at this point, we do not have that authority to oversee how they spend, because it is dispersed to the school districts. And quite frankly, that is why we do have the statement in here with regard to if there was a time to use those funds to help us move forward. Doesn't require, but it would allow them to use that as well. Senator Petty.
I think that's a good point, but we also will have more information as this session goes on about, because we do, at least a little bit of information that I know at this point, we do know that this new round of funding is going more directly to the sources and not as much through the state. So whether it's the schools or whether it's your county, maybe you heard about money that's coming for, through transportation, but it's going to be used, can be used within your counties for specific things. So that's the other thing with the school funding. I think we have to keep in mind that the funding that they did receive was pretty prescriptive for how they could use it, depending on which. So, if they got it from their county that came to them, it was still prescriptive for how they were able to use it.
Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wonder if it's just possible for us to ask for, I don't know, just some examples of how they used it or ways in which they found it to be most helpful, just so we had an idea of where we thought that was happening. And maybe that's something we each individually do with our districts.
I think that we will have that again when we get back from turnaround. I think that we will also have, I think that the Department of Education can give us examples, and I think we need to do it by school sizes. 1A, 1, 2, and 3A, 4A, 5A, 6A, because those have been very different in how they have applied them. Yes?
So did I just somehow get this? This is from Topeka. This is from Topeka School District, how they use some of their funding. I'm sorry, sometimes I get stuff and I don't, I print it off and it's like, so I couldn't remember if I got this to the committee, but it's in my folder.
Senator Sykes.
Thank you. I would say I have requested all of that information from my school districts and have very descriptive plans of how they have used it and what they will be using it for. And then as we look at those additional funds that are coming, there is a maintenance of effort in that. And I know there's lots of discussions with the State Board of Education, Department of Education, of how do we manage this too. So there are lots of great conversations going.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
this is Norma. I have also published on the Legislative Research website my most recent coronavirus spreadsheet, which includes the allocation of the ESSER 2 funds, what have been drawn down so far of the ESSER 1 funds, and then the county CRF by school district, including what was spent on remote learning, what was spent on in-person learning, what was spent on PPE and disinfecting supplies, and what was spent on payroll. And that's all by county and then school district.
Wonderful, thank you. Committee, I'm
just going to, that was so helpful. I got that. I printed it out. It is so tiny. I'm going to have to make it larger, but it was very nice.
all right, I'm going to ask us to circle back around because we need to do several things. We need to get this wrapped up. We need to wrap up Promise Act, get that up and out so that some folks can leave. We have 2 hearings that we need to get through. Senator Sykes, you may make a motion.
I would make a motion that we pass out the Department of Education, the governor's budget recommendations with the addition of the dyslexia, the coordinator position, the grants, as Senator Baumgartner has provided us with information.
And could you please add the component that the Department of Education will be covering the fiscal year 2021 from other available sources?
Yes, that part if necessary, yes.
Norma, did you get that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I was actually going to just clarify. So for fiscal year 2021, so it would be GovRec with the 250,000, I believe, for the various dyslexia positions, or just the dyslexia coordinator position and the project manager grant. So just that 180,000.
The 2 items for fiscal year 2021 are a portion of the project manager's grant and the interim coordinator.
Okay. And that would be from within existing resources. For fiscal year 2022, is it the same as fiscal year 2021? And would that be state general fund or just a funding source for clarity?
Funding source, but for 2022, and we have a printed copy for you, for 2022, that will include the Dyslexia Coordinator position, as well as the implementation grant and the remaining responsibilities for the project manager grant and the coordinator or consultant.
Sorry, Norma, I was trying to do that, but I had this sheet and you didn't have that one with the dates.
No worries. And just for clarity, so for fiscal year 2022 would be state general fund monies, or would the,
State General Fund.
okay.
So we have a motion from Senator Sykes. We have a second from Senator Dietrich. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye. Opposed? That motion passes. I will make one last request, and this does not go to Ways and Means, but it is a request. We do know that that there was a cut with regard to the Teacher of the Year program, and my request is that our Kansas Association of School Boards and that KNEA would work together to see how they might be able to support and fund and continue that program. So it's an ask, and we hope that, and I will talk with Mr. DeSetti as well. So we will have Mark and Mark try and make that work for us. Committee, we are done with our budget recommendations. I appreciate that hard work. I do want us to move to the Promise Act. You were given your draft copy of that yesterday via email. It was the copy that the reviser had given us that had, this is what the portions that had been struck and the portions that had been amended. Are there any questions for the reviser at this time with regard to the Promise Act? And again, that is Senate Bill 43. Senator Petty.
I'll make a recommendation that we pass out Senate Bill 43 as amended, favorable for passage.
Thank you. Before we move forward, our reviser, does this need to be substitute for Senate bill? Because I believe we have 6 or 7 amendments.
I can change
That
that.
is the will of the committee. If you look through that document, usually one of the criteria that we use when recommending a substitute bill is if the bill is difficult to read with as many amendments that were adopted. So it's completely up to you.
Senator.
I'll amend the motion to make a substitute for Senate Bill 43 and recommend it favorably for passage.
Thank you. Do I have a second? Second from Senator Sykes. Is there any discussion at this time? All those in favor say aye. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have your hand up? I didn't see it. So, Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We ran out of time last time, but I just want to state that I will not be supporting this bill. And my reasons being that, especially after talking with the community college representatives yesterday, though I am a student from community college, and I'm disappointed that they felt that they needed to pick 4 different areas to say, we want the taxpayers to pay for scholarships for students whose parents make a little more than maybe FAFSA would help them to qualify for. And for these particular areas to provide, that the taxpayers would provide scholarships. And I don't feel that that's the responsibility of the taxpayers, and would love to see the colleges go to the high schools and these industries promote these areas, and without the taxpayers having to pay for scholarships for those particular selected areas. So therefore, I'd be voting no.
Senator Petty? Okay. So we are back on the vote. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? Okay. Did you want your vote recorded? Okay, so we have a no from Senator Straub and Senator Gossage. Was there another no that I missed? Okay. So Senate Bill 43, substitute for Senate Bill 43, the Promise Act does pass out favorably. Yes? You can. And I just want folks to know, in our committee, if you vote against something, that's fine. When it goes on to the floor, if you want to share that with the caucus prior to or on the floor, that's fine. But if you want to explain, that's fine.
And really just to share, thank you, Madam Chair, for those listening, it's not that I don't support technical colleges or our community colleges. I absolutely do, but I agree with Senator Gossage in that just by choosing these 4 particular programs, we're choosing winners and losers. And you know, some of our community colleges focus on different programs than those that are listed here. And I just believe in providing equal opportunity to all students. So I don't want to discriminate and pick and choose programs or pick and choose by income. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll obviously address some of those issues if it gets above the line on the floor. I want to move on to Senate Bill 62, which was the vision screening bill. We had no opposition to that bill. We had some questions about implementation that were addressed in the committee. And again, that is to systematically make it so that on set years, this is when all of the kids in our schools would be screened. Do I have a motion on Senate Bill 62?
Madam Chair, I'd be happy to make a motion that we pass out Senate Bill 62 favorably.
Okay, do I have a second?
I wonder if we could send it to the consent agenda?
My only concern to the consent is it's not been on the floor before. It has kind of a multi-prong, but I will leave that up to
Madam Chair, I'm somewhat uncomfortable with that. I think I would just like to
Second.
pass it out, yeah, favorably. Thank you.
So I have a motion from Senator Dietrich, a second from Senator Petty. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Senate Bill 52 passes out favorably. Sorry, 62. Thank you. I was looking at my next one, Senate Bill 51, which is the foster care report card. That again is to codify into law. Senate Bill 51 is the foster care report card bill. To codify into law, this was a bill that was passed by the Senate last year. It was, I believe it was 38-1. And it did not pass out of the House, but it was then bundled during one of our emergency legislative meetings. And it did pass out of the House and the Senate, but it was vetoed by the governor. But then a month later, she did take that bill and the language from the foster care report card and made an executive order. And what we are doing by the passage or moving this bill out of committee is it then allows us to make it law, so it doesn't matter who's the governor. It would take the entire process to have that stricken down. Senator Gossage?
Madam Chair, I move that we pass this favorably out of committee.
Thank you. Second from Senator Straub. All those in favor say aye. There we go. Senate Bill 51 passes out favorably. Committee, I do have, I have an amendment to ACT, but I think I don't want to keep my committee members. I told you that we would run and it would be a hard 30 minutes after. So next Wednesday, we will be working Senate Bill 185, which is the deaf and hard of hearing. We will have interpreters available for that. So we will work Senate Bill 185 Wednesday. That will be first up. And I'll try and find either at some point next week, we will work Senate Bill 63. I'll go ahead and make sure that you guys get a copy of what the amendment is. It's to clean up that language. So rather than notifying, they will simply publish that information on school district websites and State Board of Education websites as to when those different tests are available so that any student can participate. Committee, we are going to now move on to an earlier portion of our agenda, which is a hearing on Senate Bill 144. And I know from my three Senate members that are in your other committee, as you have to pass out leave, that's fine. We're going to go ahead and move forward with this. And just so you know, Senate Bill 144 is a bill that has been law. It's sunset. It was a proviso for this year. So we're working at bringing this bill back. So Senate Bill 144, if our revisor could please step us through.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we heard yesterday, currently the high density at-risk student waiting sunset was July 1, 2020. Senate Bill 144 would remove the sunset on that waiting, which would have the effect of making that waiting permanent, in so much as statutory provisions can be permanent. And you can see that change. It's on page 2 of the bill in line 29, just that strike through, and the bill would take effect on July 1, 2021. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Committee, what questions do you have about this? No questions. Thank you for that explanation. At this time, we will call on Terrell Davis, Executive Director of Public Affairs, Wichita Public Schools. Terrell, thank you for listening through all of our discussion before.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here, Chair Baumgartner, and members of the committee. Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to provide comments in support of Senate Bill 144. Wichita Public Schools educates over 47,000 students annually. Over 37,000 of those students, or 74% of our student population, meet one or more criteria to be defined as at risk. 90% of our comprehensive schools have 50% or more of their student populations identified with at-risk factors. This extreme level of need requires many levels of support and innovation. Our goal is for our students to be equipped for college, career, and/or life. And with that in mind, and with the reality that so many of our students enter school with academic deficiencies, trauma effects as identified by ACEs, social emotional struggles, language barriers, and poverty obstacles. Please note that I did not say all of our students, but many of them. To use a baseball analogy, many of our students are coming up to bat with 1 or 2 strikes already. And I am happy to say that with the support of high-density at-risk funding, we are able to provide these students with the needed staff, supports, interventions, and exposure to dream, believe, and to achieve. 3 out of 4 Wichita Public School students meet the criteria considered at risk. When the percentage is that high, you have to focus on all students, and it is hard to separate 1 in 4 from the supports provided. We currently use at-risk funding to provide smaller class sizes, programs for students from K to 12, intervention programs in both ELA and math. We have extended day and extended school year programs. We have developed partnerships with local churches and organizations to provide tutoring in needed communities and impoverished neighborhoods outside the school day. Students are provided the opportunity to go to a local church and find a certified teacher there to help support them. We have developed and maintained a homework hotline where you can call, FaceTime, or log into a Teams call to receive help with your homework, Monday through Thursday. In fact, we are currently implementing 52% of the total 256 strategies outlined in the KSDE approved list of evidence-based programs. Earlier, I mentioned the obstacles that many of our students in Wichita face. And some of you may wonder, what motivates our team members? The teachers, staff, administrators are dedicated to educating all of our students, especially those who come to us with 2 strikes. We stay because we see academic movement in students and because we experience students like Maria and Dejiana, 2 of my former students who I was blessed to work with while at Truesdale Middle School, one of the poorest schools in our state, and at one time, one of the lowest performing schools. Both.
Just lost you if you want to pause. I know what it is. Is it because we're past 2:30? Okay. I don't think he hears me.
Hello, Terrell.
He doesn't hear us. Yes? Okay. Right. He's not going to answer the call because he is reading. Committee, we do have his written testimony. He is reading from it. There we are. Can you hear us at all? We lost you. We can't hear you at all. But we have your testimony, so I think we're okay. Okay. Answer your phone. So committee, we are going to move on. We have in-person testimony from Mark Tallman, Associate Executive Director, Kansas School Board Association. I will be happy to yield my time. Okay. So you are the only one that actually can address questions. So committee, do we have questions with regard to this bill? I'm sorry. Yes, Senator Brady, Mr. Brady. So committee, for those of you that are new to this process and this particular issue with regard to that high density at risk student waiting, do you have questions for either Mr. Brady or for Mr. Tallman? Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is probably for Mr. Tallman. So these numbers that are used to calculate the at-risk funding, are those based off of enrollments from potentially 2 years ago? Or are they more accurate to just the previous year?
I'm sorry, the weightings are adjusted in the current year.
And so that changes every year. Good question, great question. Any other questions with regard to this? I am seeing none. Committee, I do want to remind you that we have 10 pieces of proponent written-only testimony. Most of it is coming from superintendents. They want to see that we do maintain the high-density at-risk funding. I am going to quickly ask, and I'm hoping perhaps JG can help us. The question was posed the other day, how much is the funding for the high-density at-risk weighting, as well as the at-risk weighting? Can you tell us those numbers again? You cannot, because we can't hear you.
That's because I hadn't started talking yet. I was finding
Now
my
we
mute
can hear
button.
you. Okay.
The high density at risk was about 50, almost $55 million. I don't have the at risk number handy. I'm gonna see if I can find that real quick.
Okay. And that's actually, I was thinking that we heard it was 311 million.
That sounds about right.
Is it 310 million? Okay. If we can, just before we, or if we can have that information before we work this bill, that would be helpful. And maybe if we could see, just a look at this year and 4 years prior, just that breakout, what was high density, and what was at-risk funding. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, we'll get you that for the previous 4 years and then what we have projected.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Committee,
Yes, go ahead. Senator O'Shea.
thank you, Madam Chair. Not sure who my question's for, but as I understand it, a lot of our different weighting factors are constants, and this is one that always has to come up. And so this would just be putting it in place a little more consistently. Is that a correct assumption?
The request is for this to not have a sunset. That may be something that as we work it, it may have a sunset. It just is going to be the will of this committee and then what goes to the floor. But we are addressing it this year because we were unable to get it passed last year with COVID, and that's why it was put in as a proviso. But one of the reasons that we have sunsets is so that we actually do revisit and see if we want to make changes or keep a bill as it is. But yes, the request is to remove the sunset. Seeing no other questions, we do not have opponent or neutral testimony. We will end the hearing on Senate Bill 144, and we will move into the hearing on Senate Bill 93. And we will call on our revisor to share with us requiring the allocation of sufficient school district monies to improve academic performance of underachieving students. So welcome back, revisor.
Thank you. Senate Bill 93 relates to the allocation of school district money and the improvement of student academic performance. Current law requires the Board of Education of each school district to conduct an assessment of the educational needs of each school in the district, and the information from that assessment is used when the board prepares the school district's budget. Senate Bill 93 would amend that law to state that the information obtained from that needs assessment shall be used when preparing the budget to ensure improvement in student academic performance. Additionally, the bill would require the school district budget to, quote, allocate sufficient monies in a manner reasonably calculated to have students achieve the goals set forth in KSA 723218C, which is the statute that contains the Rose capacities. And if that language sounds familiar, it is the language from the Kansas Supreme Court's Gannon 1 opinion test for constitutional adequacy of the school finance formula. So that is where that particular language comes from. The bill would take effect upon publication in the statute book, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Committee, do you have questions for the reviser? Seeing none, we'll move on, and we have proponent testimony today from Mike O'Neill, Kansas Policy Institute. Thank you for being with us again. And would you please start with sharing us the news from, was it our committee hearing 2 days ago about a change that has occurred with the list?
Yeah, I was going to give you an update. As you'll recall, the chair asked that Heidi Zimmerman with the Legislative Post Audit and I get together because there was maybe a little misinformation. The list that Legislative Post Audit was talking about with this evidence-based practices was a list that was generated about 18 months ago. Since that Legislative Post Audit study came out, they came up with this alphabetized list that you saw yesterday, perhaps. And Heidi has confirmed in a memo that you should be in your inbox, but maybe you haven't had a chance to look at. She confirmed that this alphabetized list is new. She did also indicate, though, that she's got some concerns about the list because the list includes such things as Saxon Math, Edgenuity, and Fuel Education, which are all general education programs. So she is still concerned that this list are not true at-risk programs. During the testimony, the committee learned that a program like JAG-K was not on the list. As of 1:30 yesterday, JAG was not on this alphabetized list, and it won't be in your attachment. As of 2:36 yesterday afternoon, JAG has been added to the list. And so just in case anybody was wondering if anybody was listening to the hearing yesterday, obviously we know that somebody was, and that has been updated. But it's still probably a list worth looking at because of the concerns that LPA has.
Mr. O'Neill, the reason I did ask you to comment on that, because what is important for us is to realize the list is important. And we have school districts that have not used at-risk funding for JAG-K programs, that now that it's on the list, that would be something that they could look at as far as wanting to implement. And JAG-K is particularly effective in our high schools. We have more programs in our high schools than our middle schools, but we do have some in our middle schools. So it's important what is and isn't on the list. So thank you for that. So let's move on to Senate Bill 93.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. This one will also be familiar to individuals who served in this body last year. This bill came up before this committee and was passed out favorably. Again, it was one of the victims of the early adjournment relating to COVID. In fact, the title of the bill is almost as long as the actual amendments that you see in the bill. Something that is, I think, not well known, even among local school board members, is current law in 72-1163 says that each year the Board of Education of a school district shall conduct an assessment of the educational needs of each attendance center in the district. Information obtained from such needs assessment shall be used by the board when preparing the budget of the school district. That is current law and has been on the books for a number of years, and it's what all local school boards should be doing anyway. We have added to that the language to ensure improvement in student academic performance, and the budget of the school district shall allocate sufficient monies in a manner reasonably calculated such that all students may achieve the goals set forth in KSA 723218. Those are the Rose standards. The Rose standards, in my attachments, you'll see the fiscal note. There's no fiscal note, but they do a good job of actually listing out those Rose standards. And as the reviser told you, this is straight out of the Gannon versus State case. So in Gannon, the court found that the constitutional requirement that the legislature shall make suitable provision for the educational interests of the state includes a requirement of adequacy. The word adequacy is not in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court has interpreted that constitutional provision to have a requirement of adequacy. It's a two-pronged test, and the two-pronged test is that the structure and implementation of school finance in the case must be reasonably calculated such that all students may achieve the goals set forth in the Rose standards. So that is current law. The disconnect, however, is as we know as legislators or former legislator, that you are largely involved with the structure of school finance. You come up with a school finance formula. However, when it comes to implementation, you are not in charge of the implementation or the allocation of funds. You leave that up to the local school districts. The Supreme Court, interestingly enough, has said that the legislature has the power to allocate. We're not here to advocate anything of the sort. I think that's still a function of local control, and it should be something that the local school boards do. That is current law, and that's what the statute calls for. Except the second prong of the Gannon test is something only the local boards can satisfy. The allocation of funds should be reasonably calculated such that all those kids get to the goals that we expect. And so additional guidance for that is contained in the Kansas Department of Education's own handbook, accounting handbook for school districts. And that handbook, and I've given you the pages of the handbook there in your handouts. Instruction is code 1000, and there's a definition of what that is. But on page 71 of that handbook is the following. Quote, although all other functions are important, this function, meaning instruction, acts as the most important part of the education program, the very foundation on which everything else is built. If this function fails to perform at the needed level, the whole education program is doomed to failure, regardless of how well the other functions perform. Instruction not only includes the regular face-to-face classroom teaching, but also such things as lab sessions, independent work, and educational field trips. That has been in their handbook for a number of years. The handbook was updated as recently as March, and none of that has changed. So what is this needs assessment? Again, if you look at the website, KSDE website, you will find a buildings needs assessment form. It is admittedly somewhat dated. It hasn't been updated in quite a while because it still refers to No Child Left Behind and the requirements of state law. But nevertheless, it is instructive because it contains, as a building needs assessment, 7 sections: student needs, staff needs, curriculum needs, faculty needs, parental needs, high school needs, and other. And they indicate that below are questions which should be addressed when planning the needs at the building level. Personnel such as teachers, principals, counselors, and support staff should be involved in determining the needs of the building and district. So this is what this is the document that the department suggests is used. It's not a requirement, except the statute does require such a building-based needs assessment. So this ought to be going on at the building level every year before the budget is approved. And we've advocated for a number of years that budget should be built from the classroom up, not the administration building down. And too many times we see that these budgets are kind of placeholders. We start with what we budgeted last year and kind of fill in the blanks and add things from year to year. And I think the time in the current statute requires that the first building block of the budget needs to be building the needs at the building level and work up. So this is nothing more than perhaps not even codifying what is current law, but making sure that current law also conforms with the expectations of the Supreme Court. And I know you've been here a long time. It was like old times listening to budget discussions. I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Senator Sykes, then Senator Straub. And I think before you answer that, it might be helpful, because we do have new members on this committee, if you would simply share your legislative background. I don't think that we assume people know, but could you please share that with us, Mr. O'Neill?
Well, when I came into the legislature in 1985, my hair was a different color, if that's what you're getting at. Yeah, I served in the House for 28 years. I was at one time the chairman of education, although primarily my time was spent chairing the Judiciary Committee, and it was while I was on the Judiciary Committee that I spent a lot of time on school finance litigation issues and legislative responses. And then I served my last 4 years as House Speaker. So education has been a passion of mine. I taught 8 years at the community college level before I came to the legislature, and so I do have a passion for education. And I guess by default and by institutional knowledge, I still have a tendency to come and testify on education matters, and probably will continue to do that for the foreseeable future, God willing.
Thank you very much. Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here. I see good intentions in this, but also just, where the rubber meets the road. A lot of this, it kind of reminds me of No Child Left Behind and mandating that 100% of students meet adequate yearly progress. I will say I have a very exceptional child. His math score, I think right now is 107 in school. So he gets a 100 on his final. That technically can move his brain down. How do you measure progress in situations like that? I mean, there's not room for improvement in there. So I guess, how do you determine this? Also, looking at students who were not in the school the year before and they're moving, how do you make sure you're looking at progress when it's really hard to do apples to apples, if that makes sense?
That's a difficult question to answer because that's what the court's expectations are. They were the ones that came up with the Rose standards and said that this is what, and we've codified those because the court asked us to do that. Our funding has been based upon this two-prong test, and fundamentally, we have kids that are meeting those goals. In the real target area, and I don't know whether it was Gannon 4 or 5, we've had so many of them, but they actually identified the target population of students that we were really talking about. So the Gannon analysis went from a discussion of all funds to a more focused approach to the kids that are lagging behind and need the extra help. And that's why you see legislation like targeting at-risk funds, having an at-risk weighting, and trying to get those targeted so that the kids that are not meeting those goals can meet those goals. And that's why we want to spend enough time making sure that that money for at-risk doesn't get diluted and it gets focused on programs that are going to lift the kids up that are frankly being left behind. No Child Left Behind is not the law of the land now, it's ESSA, I think, but No Child Left Behind was a great descriptor of the challenge that the schools are facing. And so one of the attachments is actually the only thing that we can compare apples to apples with other states are the NAEP scores, and we realize that those are not necessarily what we're all using, but all students in all states take those assessment tests, so that's the best way that we have thus far of comparing our students with other states. I just use that as an illustration that I don't think any of us are accepting of where a lot of our students are at this point in time, and we need to keep working on getting the services to those at-risk students in particular. Don't know if I answered your question, but a lot of this is driven by that school finance litigation and the legislature's response to that.
If I may.
Senator Straub. We'll go back. Go ahead and ask the question, and then we'll come back to Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your testimony. And are we using, so it's my understanding our Kansas state assessments are specific to Kansas only. They're not used in any other state. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have our own set of assessments, but everybody takes the assessments that NAEP tracks, and Mark would probably be a better conferee on the specifics of that.
And so these needs assessments are based off of those scores? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not necessarily based on scores. It's based on the law that says that you need to do a needs assessment, and I would just invite you to look at the questions, because it's a broad range of things, including parental involvement, and are your teachers highly qualified, how many kids that are at risk, and it's just without regard to whether you even have assessments, it's what the state expects the budget process to involve, if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily
That
linked.
does. Okay, thank you.
Senator Sykes, followed by Senator O'Shea. Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How do we enforce this?
One of the things I thought about doing is actually having the legislature require that the needs assessment be posted. We do a lot of we've had a lot of transparency pieces where if the school does something, we have them post us like a summary of their budget or whatever. And so literally the needs assessment contemplates answers, specific answers to questions, how many kids are at risk or whatever. I gave some thought to saying, okay, not only should you follow current law and have the needs assessment, but let's have the public be made aware of that by posting it on the website. I didn't, but that would be up to the committee. Frankly, just to be real candid about this, we still talk about school finance litigation. This is one of the few sessions where we haven't had school finance litigation pending. And so far, the dollars amount that have been appropriated have been found by the court to be constitutional. But there's always that risk that if you do something that somebody construes as being less than what you promised 2 years ago, you could be back in court. The struggle for the legislature when they're in court is that they have no control over the second prong of the Gannon test. And so this definitely makes it clear that the local boards have that responsibility. We can't guarantee that there isn't going to be litigation, but if there's going to be litigation, let's talk about everyone who's responsible for the allocation of resources such that every child has the opportunity to meet the goals set forth in statute.
Senator Sykes, did you have a question? Okay. Thank you very much. Next up,
Madam Chair.
we have Mark Tallman again, Associate Executive Director of Kansas School Board Association, with opponent testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I know you are really pressed for time, so I'm kind of struggling here, but you're having a good conversation. So with the respect to the previous speaker, for whom is a much, much younger and less gray lobbyist I used to lobby, I will say I'm a little flummoxed, because if the only testimony we would hear about this bill was what he just gave, then we might be on the same side as we were yesterday, kind of shockingly, because I don't think any of our members disagree with this intent. I think he has agreed that this doesn't direct how dollars have to go. It is sort of a reminder of what's important to boards. Now, I will say I've worked with a lot of school boards in many years, and I don't know a single board that doesn't think when they write their budget they're trying to improve student achievement. That's why they run, that's why they get elected, that's why their communities support them. We appear here today as an opponent, and we struggle with this only because the conversation often goes to the direction of what you may have heard as the 65% to instruction. And we disagree with that. We don't think it is good policy to suggest there is a single number, particularly when I'm not sure it is well understood what goes into that. And I fully admit this bill doesn't change that, but so often when we've had these conversations before, that's the issue that has come up. So in my testimony, what I mostly do is try to talk about some things I think you need to know about that. Number one, what is included in instruction and what isn't, where we are as a state, I've put in one of each of your individual districts to show what your allocation is, with the argument that we believe it is functionally impossible to get to 65%. Moreover, we find no correlation on our state assessments between the percent you spend on instruction and how well you do on those tests. We find no real correlation on NAEP tests between the percent on instruction and how well schools perform. Although I would note, Kansas is one of the higher ranking states on what goes into instruction, and Kansas is a high ranking state on the number of teachers we hire per our population compared to others. So I guess in a sense, in terms of this bill itself, I don't think there is real disagreement. I think our only difference maybe is our belief that honestly, it doesn't matter what label or what category you put the money in. What matters is how effective you're doing that. You can, I've said the easiest way to, I used to say, the easiest way to raise what you spend on instruction is to give every teacher a raise to do exactly the same thing they've been doing. It may be great in the long run, it's probably not going to change the results. I've now said the best way to reduce instruction would be to go fully remote, so you don't have to pay for buildings and utilities and all of those things. I think we all agree that is not a good way to raise achievement. So that's why I guess we appear as an opponent, is not to really the content of the bill as it is, but where the direction at least sometimes goes. And so I'll quit there and see if you have questions, Madam Chair, if it's okay with you.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Tallman. It seems that many of the school board meetings that I've either listened in on seem to focus on maintenance of buildings and vehicles and whatnot, and much less of the conversation is actually about the instruction of students. So I would say that this bill seems to be just that, a reminder to school boards that you're not just here to maintain a school. The purpose of education is to educate the child, not to provide for buildings and jobs and buses and whatnot. So I do think that it's important to keep that in first and foremost is the education of the children. So thank you.
I absolutely agree with that.
I guess my question would be, how many of our school districts, we have 286, how many of those are using zero-based budgeting, where they actually are building the budget from ground up? It has never been my experience, at least at the K through 12 level, that has been the approach, but rather it has been, here's what we budgeted in prior years. This is the revenue we anticipate coming in. How are we going to divvy that up? So could you talk to us a little bit about what do you, now that all school districts are members of KASB, what percent of your districts would you say are using zero-based budgeting? Is that a training that you provide for them?
We don't provide training on budgeting. I think we let the Department of Education be responsible for that. I doubt many school districts would be that formal, and I think most school districts, and I will honestly say my experience are much like the legislature. You start with where you are. What is the staff you have? Who are the teachers coming back? What buildings do you have and how you have to operate them? In any school district, I think however you start the budget, you start with what you have to do, and then you have discussions of, if we have new resources, where should they go? If we have fewer resources, what do we need to cut? If we see areas that need more focus, let's go find that. So I doubt many have that formal process, but I do, and I guess that would be the distinction. I don't know how many. We're trying to help draw people's attention to this law and this needs assessment. So I'm guessing that many boards may not formally do a needs assessment, but I think, you know, they hire superintendents, they hire staff, they hire business people, and it is a months-long process to do assessment of what they think the district needs.
So I think I will circle back and take it from another direction. It's been my experience that administration, typically the superintendent, it might be the business director, prepares the budget. That is then given to the board to approve. So what instruction or guidance or training does KASB provide for school board members on how to evaluate when you are looking at a budget? Because unless folks have been responsible for budgeting in a work experience, their budget has been limited to what they do at home. So what training does KASB do with regard to, okay, 6 or 7 school board members per school board? These are the kinds of questions to ask. These are the things to look at. This is the information you should want to have so that that end goal actually is achieved.
Well, one thing to note is our training is only available when it's requested or people come to it. Again, and I'm not directly involved with that. I don't think it involves a lot of budgeting per se. It is very much around things like district goals, your student achievement goals, your strategic vision for the district. A lot of our work is trying to help boards and their leadership team identify what are the goals you need to have to get better, to improve your achievement and other community values. How then will you set those out as goals? And then your job as a board is to assign to your administration to be the ones that come up with the implementation plan, whether it's through budget, whether it's through policy. We see that role, the distinction. The board hires the professional staff, gives them the vision, gives them the goals, expects them to bring those back. And then we always say, then you need to also regularly evaluate that personnel on the progress that they're helping you make as a district.
Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Tallman may not be knowledgeable of this, not that you're not knowledgeable of many, many, many things, but there is training offered through Kansas Association of School Boards for our board members. And there's a book called The Key Work of School Boards, and it talks about the different components of their job, evaluating curriculum, instruction, staff, negotiating contracts, managing the budget. And at the end of each section, there's a questionnaire for you personally as the board member. Do you need more information? Has this covered everything that you need to be able to do your job? And then during the year, there are other things that you can go to. Not every board takes advantage of that. And I think that's part of the issue. You know, sometimes you have very well, I won't say well-trained boards, but you have boards who understand the work that they're required to do. They're very professional about it. They ask good questions. They pay attention, go to workshops. You know, they're the honest broker at the board table, but that's not true of every district. And I agree, you know, there are things that we must do better. Absolutely. Thank you.
I guess I was just curious if changes had been made. I'm familiar with the book, but I was curious if changes had been made as far as training and things to look at, particularly since so much emphasis. What I have seen is a real disconnect. So we have school districts that spent funds to litigate the state all the way to the Supreme Court for more funding. We had a Supreme Court that said not doing enough for the lower 25%. So as we work, in fact, you know, the bill that we had today, high density at risk, it's high density at risk on top of at-risk funding. But I have not seen a pivot or a transition since litigation on the way in which school boards and administration that recommend budgets, but the way in which they're looking at budgets other than how much more money are we getting? These are the things that we need. But not really focusing primarily on that issue of the 25% that the court said needed to be a focus, not only in funding, but in actual achievement. And so that would be one area that I think if holistically, everybody's going to be working together, that would be something that would need to change as far as how to help school board members. And unfortunately, our representative from USA isn't here. How to help superintendents focus to that issue of what the courts have addressed. Because what I hear locally and what I have seen from school district after school district, it's just about what did the courts decide we need to receive as far as funding. Little focus on what it is we in our school district need to achieve with that funding. And we are going to need a whole lot, just like, you know, the heavy lift we're trying to do with dyslexia. It hasn't been the school boards that came to say we need this. It wasn't the teachers that came to say we need this. It was parents. Certainly hasn't been the universities. It's been parents that have been very frustrated. And we're seeing frustration now bubble up in other areas, and that is the way in which education hasn't been delivered this year. All of us want to think it's a one-off, but the impact of this school year, I've heard many people start to refer this school year as the lost year because of the loss in face-to-face and in learning. And we had some of that last year to the extent that the graduation requirements were reduced so significantly. So that would be something that I would like to see, that we have that buy-in in the future, and that will require some different types of training for this. These are some things that the courts have said have to be focused on.
I don't want to prolong, Madam Chair. I completely agree with you. I can only tell you from I think our perspective, our staff, our board, there is very much a focus that one of our key responsibilities is increasing student achievement. You can't achieve student achievement without, number one, we hope helping all children, but particularly those who are falling behind. A focus on equity to recommend that some are not there. And that is why we support the state board's new accreditation focus, the Kansas CAN outcomes. I was listening to you, I was trying to go through what charts I had. I don't have one that I know where we've done a breakdown of the new money since Gannon by fund, and how much of that has been expended from like at-risk funds, how much from bilingual, how much from special education. So now, again, part of that's because you directed it, and we have no objection to that. So there is data that shows since Gannon where districts have put those new dollars, and I believe it has been heavily weighted in those areas as it should have been.
With regard to budget, and we did hear this from the legislative post-audit, and I addressed that briefly earlier in today's committee meeting, with regard to limits of what is left in unencumbered funds. Has KASB looked around to other states? Because we heard in post-audit that of those school districts that they looked at, none of them had guidelines for you should always have at least this much reserve. So that's the bottom level, but probably isn't prudent to have above a certain amount. Do you know if your organization has looked to other states to see with regard to that?
I have not looked into what other states might have done. I do know that at one time, for a number of years, there was a cap, a percentage cap on contingency funds, and that cap was raised several years with our support. It was then, and it might have been during the Mr. O'Neill's speakership, that was taken off, which we were happy to support. But at that time, we were not really advocating that. Now, that's only one fund, I would say. But I think if you look at the history, districts tended to increase their percentage, and I guess I disagree just slightly with the approach that post-audit took in looking at dollar amounts instead of percent of budget, but I think that percent did go up around the time of the last Great Recession, and it has come down a little, not as much as it was, because I think both that the change in the contingency limits and such were part of the reason that happened. Madam Chair, we do not necessarily, we don't have a position that says there should be no limits on funds. We just think if so, it needs to be reasonable, there needs to be flexibility, possibility for exceptions if needed, but don't penalize districts for not following a law or a policy or guideline that hasn't been there. If we want to set some things going forward, we'll be happy to have that conversation, but as you saw in the report, local boards have widely different views, but you know, some of those are, I mean, I will tell you, some local board members, believe it or not, are really conservative people who really think you should have money in the bank. That's just how they feel. And so if the state wants to come in and say, we're going to put some limits, then they'll have to respond to that. But a lot of board members have come up through 10 years of a lot of turbulence, and they see it as prudent to have high reserves. And others have what some people might say are pretty low reserves.
I think that's something that, from a legislative standpoint, might be more helpful if school districts began to look at that issue, and using the legislative post-audit as a springboard for there aren't set policies, that school districts are going from superintendents to superintendent or whatever is the makeup of the board at that time, and it tends to be a very ad hoc, but that notion of having goals and guidelines helps with regard to that, and it helps with asking the question, okay, why haven't these funds been spent? Or are we making sure that we do have those reserves?
And
So,
either to the, and I'd mean to interrupt, but if you ever have time, and I doubt you will, or individually, we'd be happy to show what we've looked at in terms of flexible funds compared to flexible, and we would argue for the last 10 years, the percentage has actually been pretty level. And there's a lot of variation around that, but overall, the percent of flexible funds compared to operating budgets has stayed right around that kind of 2 months, 15% guidelines, but would certainly acknowledge there's wide variation on either side.
thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions, so thank you so much for your testimony. I am going to close the hearing today on Senate Bill 93 and committee. We are adjourned.